Hi folks, it's Thibaut Van Dam here with another YouTube video, and for those of you who are not familiar with my channel, I am a DIY singer-songwriter and guitar tutor based in Southeast London. And today I'm very excited to be continuing my video series all about practical guitar and music theory. Specifically today, we're going to be looking at a topic called intervals. Intervals are such an integral part to understanding how chords are formed, to how scales are formed, and even how we end up coming up with key signatures or chord progressions. So if this sounds interesting to you, please consider liking the video, please consider subscribing to the channel. It's absolutely the best way to stay up to date with the new content I make, and of course it continues to motivate me to make videos like this. Thank you to everyone that does subscribe. I have so much to get through, so without further ado, let's get into it. So today, to help me in this video, I have a few resources, specifically my notes, some ideas that I've written down. And I'm also going to be referring to a book I mentioned in my previous video all about actually resources. So this is a book called Hal Leonard Music Theory Under the Guitar Method. There are a few books in this series, and I don't have an affiliate link unfortunately, but you can definitely find this book. It's not that expensive, and it is a pretty useful book, although it's worth pointing out that as I was going to this chapter today about intervals within the book, which is chapter 4, I found that strangely, for some reason, that intervals were not discussed that early on. For example, in chapter 3, Tom Kolb, who's the author of this book, talked about the circle of fifths. And I just think, and also in chapter 3, the discussion of chords took place. And I just think it just doesn't make sense to understand chords before understanding intervals, because chords are structured off of intervals. So it's really more the building blocks. The first thing we have to understand intervals really, or to understand chords, is really first chromatic scale, then intervals, then chords, but actually at the same time we could also equally learn scales. And so that's why I've decided, following my video of the chromatic scale, that I will be talking about intervals in this video today. Now, like I said, understanding intervals, it's crucial that you understand the chromatic scale first. And so because of that, I'm actually going to do a brief recap, even though I have done a video about it already. There will be a link in the description if you want to see that video. It is kind of long, but it's very thorough. And I will try to give you the highlights here, just so that way this video is a little bit more complete. So the chromatic scale includes the 12 possible notes we can play on the guitar, whether that's electric, acoustic, or classical. There are some anomalies to this, but don't worry about that. If you have a guitar that looks like this, with all these frets, you probably have a guitar that is subject to the chromatic scale, especially if you're interested in playing kind of popular music or Western style music like rock. So the chromatic scale includes these 12 possible notes. The notes are alphabetized, so fortunately they follow a nice order, which involves letters going from A to G. And there are additional notes. So I said that there are 12, but if you count A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, you end up with only 7 different possible notes. So there are actually an additional 5 notes, which are called accidentals. Now, accidentals can be called a note plus a sharp or a flat, and sharp and flat are actually relative terms, and they're also interchangeable. So for instance, if you were to say play a note like F sharp, the reason this note is called F sharp is it's because it's the note that is sharpened after the note F. So you have E, F, then F sharp. Now this same note, F sharp, could also be called G flat, because if we started from the note G, we could flatten it to play the note F sharp. All to say that when you have a note that is sharp, it is the pitch that is higher than the initial reference note. So F sharp is a sharpened F, whereas G flat is a flattened G, and so the pitch is lower than the reference note. So this is G, and that is a G flat. Now the notes are interchangeable, but if you gave it just a little bit of thought, you could start to see how these topics, this idea of like sharp and flat being interchangeable, that could get like pretty chaotic. So the way that I like to organize the idea of what is sharp and flat is I primarily think exclusively in terms of sharps. And this is because I tend to start in open position, which is to say I play the bottom 3 chords here usually, and I usually am going up. Not to say that I don't go ever down, not to say that that's not a thing I don't do, it's just I mostly like to think of sharpening, and it's just a way of keeping the notes nice and organized. So as we go through the chromatic scale now, you'll see that I'm only including things like sharps. So starting from the note E, we have E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A, And I just want to point out there that A is actually the cycle of the chromatic scale at play. So like I said, it runs from A to G sharp, at which point it actually returns back to A, which is what we've just done. Now we have A sharp, B, and C. And I just want to point out there that between B doesn't actually have a sharp, it just goes to C. And equally, you could say that C does not have a flat, it just goes to B. And the same is actually true, although I've sort of skimmed over it, it's actually true also of E. E didn't go to E sharp, it went to F. So it's important to take note of that. So moving forward, we have B, C, C sharp, D, D sharp, and finally E again. And this idea of going from E to E is actually exactly the cycle of the full chromatic scale. And I may have mentioned in a previous video all about guitar anatomy, but actually the point at which the neck usually meets the body is where we'll usually find that 12th fret. And I might have used the term in that video called the octave. And the octave is exactly what is leading us to intervals today. The octave is one of the 12 possible simple intervals that we can play. And all to say, and to neatly lead me to this topic, intervals therefore describe or characterize the amount of space between any two notes in the chromatic scale. So for instance, the note E to the note E, a chromatic scale away, is called an octave. That is the name of that interval, and it characterizes exactly that. But if we were to play the 12th fret on the A string, so we play the note A, and we were to skip through 12 frets and play the note A again, we would find that we're actually playing another octave. This is an octave, A to A, and so is E to E. And this is a really important idea to start to take on board. And it's probably the hardest idea to kind of convey concerning intervals, so that's why I'm going to try to tackle it first, which is that the amount of space between any two notes is equal, basically. Just like how on the chromatic scale, F sharp is not any smaller of a note or less significant of a note than, say, G. So each of the notes is equally spaced, and we call that equal temperament. The same can be said actually of intervals. So the amount of space is actually equilateral in a sense. So to give you a more visual example, here I have a ruler before me, and the amount of space between the 0 mark on this ruler and the 1 mark is just 1 inch, right? But if we were to go up to the 5 mark on the ruler and count to the 6 mark, well, we also know, right, that is also just 1 inch. Just like 0 to 1 is 1 inch, so is 5 to 6. And the way we solve for that is actually by doing a little bit of math. We end up subtracting 5 from 6 to result in that 1 inch. And so this space is actually the same as that space. And this example, I think, is a really strong way of understanding intervals, actually. This idea of space, and rather the space not discriminating between which note you actually are starting from, is actually hugely important. That's not to say that you shouldn't take note of the note you're actually playing. For instance, if you start on E, in order to understand how far you're going, you have to remember that you started from 5 and went to 6. So 5 could be considered the equivalent of a note, like E, for instance. And it does get a little bit weird because, unfortunately, we don't use numbers to describe the notes, but in a way, by having letters, it keeps things organized, especially because the chromatic scale, just to remind you, is organized in an alphabetical way. So it does go A, B, C, D, E, F, G. It's just some of these notes have sharps, and you could call them interchangeably flats, and then some do not. So now that we've talked about what intervals are, and we've talked about the amount of space between any two notes in this concept of universality, let's talk about two different ways that we can actually experience intervals. Intervals can be experienced both sequentially and harmonically. And when I say sequentially, I do mean one after the other. So for example, when we play intervals in a sequential way, we have a tendency to form patterns which then relate to or pertain to scales. We actually form scales using intervals and spaces between assorted notes. And so this idea, what I've just played, is actually the major scale. You may have recognized it. And I call it the major scale because the major scale actually describes a pattern of intervals that we follow. So we follow a certain set of spaces between our notes, and therefore there's nothing unique about the fact I started from E Now, the fact I started from E does tell us which specific notes to play, but the actual pattern doesn't change. So that's why we can hear the major scale not only in the scale of E, but also in, say, the scale of C versus E. So this idea of the pattern being able to, you copy and paste it, this is a very important idea. It has to do with that first idea we talked about, universality. Now, another way to play intervals I mentioned is harmonically, or when you play them stacked. And when you stack intervals or play them at the same time, you end up playing things called chords. And so chords are where you end up hearing a space between various notes, and you end up being able to interpret that series of notes in a certain order. Now, with each of these ways of playing intervals, both sequentially and also stacked or as chords, there are actually two biases we face, and they are respective to each of those things. So when we play intervals in a sequential way, we end up relating later notes to former notes. So if we start from E, we tend to relate later notes, like F sharp or G sharp, to that first thing we heard, or rather, more specifically, the most recent previous thing we heard. So we relate the F sharp to the G, we relate the G sharp to the F sharp. And this is how we form this idea of the major scale. Now, just to illustrate this idea a little bit further, if we were to play the exact same notes as the E major scale, and in the same order, but we started them from a different point, we could actually yield a very different result. This is something called a mode, and I will talk about it in a later video, but this idea of this bias is super present. Just by contrast, what I just played was the Phrygian mode, and when I play the E major scale, there's kind of this vibe it gives off, this kind of happy major vibe. But when I play something in Phrygian, when I play that same scale, but starting from the third position, it doesn't really feel major in the same way. It feels different. And that's the impact that sequential bias can have on us. Now, when we look at another bias relating to chords, we end up experiencing pitch bias. So when I play this major chord, E major, I end up playing E either first or last, depending on how I strum it. So we have the sequential bias because we heard E technically first. But even if I pluck them all at the same time like this, we still relate to the lowest pitched note. And this is our pitch bias, that we have a tendency to recognize the lowest possible notes as actually the reference point for the subsequent intervals. Just like we think about it with time, the same thing applies with pitch. So lower frequencies tend to have more energy. This is a physics principle called the fundamental. And we end up thinking of that low note as the reference point by which we interpret the remainder of the notes. Now, this is an important, these two things, these biases we have, sequential bias and a stacked bias or a harmonic bias, pitch bias, we have to take consideration when we go through forming chords as a way of understanding what we're actually playing, or a way of interpreting, rather, what we're playing. Now, this idea of interpretation also plays a very important role. And to sort of illustrate this, I would ask that anyone that was watching this would write up the chromatic scale twice over. They would draw they would write A sharp, B, C, C sharp, and so on, using that information of the chromatic scale. And then they would go back to G sharp and then repeating A sharp, B, C, and so on. And what I would ask you to do is to circle the note A and draw a line from that A to, say, the subsequent D, the D that follows it in a linear sense. Now, that amount of space is called a perfect fourth interval. And in a moment, I'll show you a drawing I've made, an illustration of all the intervals, and I'll clear that up. But for now, just acknowledge that that amount of space can be described, like we talked about before with an octave, that's described as a perfect fourth interval. But if we were to circle that note D and go to the following A, the amount of space between that first D and that subsequent A is actually a perfect fifth. It is 7 semitones away, or 7 half steps, right? Whereas before we only had 5. So A to D does not equal D to A. There is only one interval where this does actually happen, called the tritone. And the tritone it's located equally distanced from a initial note itself and then its octave. So E is equally spaced from A sharp as it is from the following E. They're equally 6 spaces away, 6 and 6, and 6 plus 6 equals 12, which is our chromatic scale. So it's very important to take that into consideration. Now that plays a role, this idea of how to calculate intervals. That is informed usually by our biases. So what we heard first, second, and third, sequential bias, and also pitch bias. But it is also important to recognize that we actually have a choice. When we play something, we can choose how to interpret, how to play it. And I probably will explain this a little bit more when I discuss something called the harmonized major scale, and when I talk about ways of deviating from it. But it is very crucial to take into consideration that information. So now that we've talked about what intervals are and different ways of thinking about them, like playing them sequentially or stacked, let's actually talk about what the actual literal intervals are, because in fact they are prescribed. We actually have titles for each and every single possible space we can play as an interval. So I'll draw up this sort of image, this illustration I made all about sort of music theory, and I'm really hoping that if you see that image, it's color-coded, and you can see that minor intervals are associated with one color, majors are associated with a different color. You might also see we have perfect intervals, and we also have a tritone, which I mentioned just a moment ago. Now these intervals, the reason I color-coded it is because there is actually a pattern you can follow. Now I'll just go through each of these intervals. And one thing I will point out about this book, which is really useful, the book Hal Leonard's Music Theory, is that there's actually a page in it which explores ear training. Ear training, page 28, which actually gives references, different song examples where the opening notes of that song can be characterized as a specific interval. So as I go through it, I might actually mention the specific song that they're referring to. So when we play a note and we don't actually play another space between that note, we just play that same note twice, that's called unison. And the example I give, because they didn't actually give one in this book, is if you ever heard that term Christmas carolers, singing in unison, it's because they're singing the same note, and they're singing harmonically at the same time. So that interval is 0 to 0, there's no space change. So therefore it's unison. Now unison is a useful interval actually, and it's good to take note of. Same with the octave is also a useful interval because it has a sound quality that's worth taking note of. Now if we play the amount of space of one fret, which is also called a semitone or a half tone or a half step, you could call it. This is called the minor second. And the song example given in this book about music theory is the theme from Jaws. Now, that's to say that the amount of space between E and F is a minor second space. And so it sounds sort of minor to us, and it also sounds kind of dissonant. And that's how we can sort of think about the minor second interval. Now, it's worth pointing out now, and just to reiterate that idea of universality in practice, that if, for instance, the shark couldn't sing in the key of E, right? E to F. Like me, I can't sing that low E. That's just too low for me. Then maybe we would change the key, and we could play the theme from Jaws in another key. We could play it starting from another point, right? We could play the note, say, A to A sharp. And that amount of space, A to A sharp, is the same amount of space as E to F. And so we characterize it in the same way. Those are both minor second intervals, and therefore the theme of Jaws is not specific to E or A. It could be played on any of the notes because it's about the space, not the note. And the note, again, is important to take note of because it's how you measure that space. But besides that, it's not really the most crucial thing to be thinking about. The space is what we have to take consideration of. And so as we continue our study, we now can go forward and say, well, if we had 3 frets, what is that? Well, that is our minor third interval. And the example they gave in the book is Greensleeves. Then with 4 spaces, we have our major third, followed by 5 spaces, which is our perfect fourth. And then followed by 6 spaces, which is our tritone. 7 spaces, which is our perfect fifth. Then 8 spaces, which is our minor sixth. 9 spaces, which is our major 6th, then 10 spaces, which is our minor 7th, then 11 spaces, which is our major 7th, and then finally 12 spaces, which is our octave. And hopefully that's all visible on the screen with that image that I have described. And each of these can be associated with a song. It's not exclusive to those songs, but for example, they give the example of Greensleeves being the minor 3rd. Dum, 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 you know, that whole thing. And these are ways of sort of remembering that. And I've just sort of gone through a few of them. I might not be able to take a photo of that, but I might post a list of those song examples. It's very useful, but I, again, would just recommend you get the book. So we've talked about quite a lot of different things, and we've gone through all of the intervals. It's worth pointing out that as we surpass the octave, we do get to things called compound intervals. And compound intervals are how we establish things like chord extensions. But again, this is a topic that we'll talk about in a later video. So I think at this point I've talked about most of the important things, and I've stressed some of the most important things related to intervals. Intervals, as you can see, therefore, are not only, as they say in the book, they say that intervals are not only, they say that they're the incremental building blocks from which melodies are constructed. I would go so far as to say that intervals are therefore actually the incremental building blocks, the essential building blocks of not only how melodies are formed, but how harmonies are understood, how we construct chords, how we construct scales, how we construct solos, and eventually how we actually come up with our chord progressions, how we start to understand how songs are written. And so I would definitely recommend that if you've seen this video, to try to work on establishing a strong understanding of the chromatic scale to begin with, just memorizing those notes and the order of them, which notes have accidentals, which ones do not. E and B don't have sharps, there you go. And then to take some time and just focus on really kind of sitting with that idea of universality and the actual spaces. And then if you can, try to memorize those spaces. Now, fortunately, I mentioned that there's a pattern that's visible. So we do sort of have some patterns available to us. And in a way, the interval sort of list is sort of symmetrical. We have minor, major, minor, major. And that idea can be copied and pasted. We have minor, major, and then we have perfect, tritone, perfect, minor, major, minor, major. Now, it's not a full reflection, but that idea of minor, major does show up twice. And so hopefully that can be the beginnings of trying to remember these ideas and trying to commit them to memory. Because if you can remember the chromatic scale and you can remember the order of intervals and apply them and use them regularly in how you work out chords and fretting and things, these will be things that are incredibly valuable, especially as we move forward talking about the harmonized major scale, or even just developing major and minor scales, or major chords and minor chords. Because at the end of the day, major chords and minor chords are formulated off of intervallic formula. So we end up with a formula, which is, we have our root, we have our perfect fifth, then we have a major third or a minor third. So it's not actually about the notes, although they are relevant, it's about the spaces between those notes. I hope that idea is really hitting home. And anyway, I think I've stressed it enough. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this informative and helpful. If you did, please give this video a like. Please consider subscribing to the channel. It is the absolute best way to stay up to date with the new content I make. It definitely motivates me to keep making these videos. Thank you to the people that do subscribe. It's why I'm here. It's because I've been seeing more subscribers and I want to stay active on the channel. And I just want to also say that if you do feel like anything was unclear, you're welcome to write a comment in the comment section below. I will try to get back to you as soon as I can. And if you do want to arrange a lesson, I have a link in the description below as well, where if you want to talk about this idea in more detail, I'm happy to help you sort of develop your understanding of intervals or any other sort of ideas related to playing guitar. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you at the next video. Ciao for now.